Hopefully Joe will be able to make sure that no one kind of does inappropriate things online. So why don't we go ahead and take it away, Pete, Klenow.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. This is joint work with Chen Kai-Shei, a frequent collaborator, and Kazuatsu Shimizu, who's an incoming graduate student at MIT. And the title here is Romer+Ricardo, which is kind of bold. The title I kind of wanted was Romerian versus Ricardian trading. But same kind of meaning, I guess, hopefully. So what we have in mind is that partly that, when I teach a second year growth class, or even a first year, I teach the Romer model, and I teach again how creative destruction. This one has horizontal varieties that are very imperfectly substitutable. This one has all this creative destruction because people are coming up with varieties that are very substitutable for the previous varieties. And that kind of dualism exists in the trade literature as well, as an outsider, as I perceive it. You've got the Krugman and Mallets and the representation of the kind of Romer horizontal varieties, and then you have all the way back to Ricardo, and more recently the whole Eaton-Gordon line that takes advantage of these vertical differences. So I say comparative advantage, I mean Ricardian comparative advantage, the quality ladders there. And so then the question that sometimes I get from first or second year students is, why do these parallel paths exist? Like, is it just a taste choice that we get to make about which way we model it, or is the real world going to tell us which is important, which is more important? So that's kind of where we're coming from, is having a unified model that's got both the Romerian Mallets varieties, but also the Ricardo Eaton-Gordon quality ladders, and see which is more important for things like growth, but also trade and maybe TFP differences across countries. Maybe some countries are really good at creating new varieties, and other ones are really good at climbing on top of existing ladders and taking them over. And so maybe we could have rich countries that do one or the other, and see which ones they are. That's our goal in this paper. So one thing, partly thinking Sam's here, Eaton-Gordon have an older paper that did unify, like Sam's whatever year, doesn't matter. His stock market paper in Econometrica is a really nice paper that had quality ladder driven growth with the Eaton-Gordon trade framework. So what's different here is that we're basically doing two things differently. One is we're adding the variety dimension and trying to play them off against each other and see, and then adding the empirical dimension. So we're not fully nesting it though, because they had endogenous draws of, I think in that paper, endogenous draws for innovation, and we're going to have exogenous arrivals, as you'll see. So we're not totally nesting them, but certainly we're adding the horizontal varieties, and we're going to try to come up with data to back out the relative importance of these things. Okay, so the model, which this is only the second time I've presented this, the first time was 2 days ago, so it might not be optimized in the sense of, I think I need more details on the model than you're going to see, but feel free to ask any questions about what we're doing. But I'm going to do broad first, give you a preview of the results, and then I'll give you more details on the model, but probably not enough. So picture at any point in time, there's going to be trade in this model. It's going to be multi-country, and when we come to the data, we'll have like 20 countries and 20 countries in the simulation. So picture at any point in time, there's a product we're going to call Romerian, meaning that nobody produces a perfect substitute for that in the world, and nobody has a blueprint to do that. And the Ricardian is anyone that another country has a blueprint to produce. So there's a perfect substitute out there, and now they're head-to-head competitors, and things like tariffs and wage differences then become critical. Whereas this one, it's like in Mallets, that person's got a monopoly on that variety. There's things that are imperfect substitutes out there. They still face all the Mallets type fixed costs. But so picture we've got the Mallets force, but we've also got at the same time these products that somebody else has come up with a blueprint that's innovated on top of it. So you have this head-to-head competition. And then the growth is going to come from both forces. So there's going to be new varieties being introduced over time, but also quality ladder jumps being taken over time. And then the countries are going to be linked through knowledge spillovers. I don't think the Eaton-Gordon paper didn't have any knowledge spillovers, either domestic or international. So we're building that in. It comes quite naturally in a multi-country model because it's going to tether countries together. It keeps them all growing at the same rate. So we build it in. We like it because that seems to be a feature of, like, say, the OECD. You have big differences in patenting and R&D, but they all grow at the same rate. One way to understand that is their growth is linked through technology diffusion. So we've got that here. So the model is going to have, trade at a point in time is due to both sources, and growth is due to both sources. But as I'm saying here, they're going to have differences in TFP levels, but not differences in growth rates. And then I'll preview it, but then I'll keep trying to give you the intuition before I show you the data, is that the key intuition about how we're going to try to pin this down in the data is that a brand new variety should show up as a lot of export growth in a particular category. I mean, ideally, we'd see the individual product and we'd say, oh, look, Taiwan is exporting semiconductors. They never exported that before. That's them entering the semiconductor industry with a new variety. Or you could see their imports decline at the same time. So they used to import semiconductors and now they don't so much, but they have this explosion in their exports of semiconductors. We'd say, oh, that looks like creative destruction. It looks like they're simultaneously exporting a lot and reducing their imports in that category. So they're not generating a new variety on the market. But that's the key intuition, is that the right tail of burst of export growth could come from creative destruction or new varieties. But if you're shrinking imports at the same time, that's what we're going to say is evidence that it's creative destruction. If you don't see the shrinking of imports at the same time, we're going to say that's more like a new variety. That's the very indirect inference we're going to do. So we're going to look at data on import and export growth, pretty aggregated, like 4-digit categories, because that's where we can get a lot of countries at once, and then try to infer these sources of growth from that. Okay, so I'm going to go into more detail, but before that, let me just preview the results, which are going to be the growth accounting. 56% is going to be Romer, 44% is going to be Aguillon, Howitt, Grossman, Heltman, and then how much comes from own innovation versus foreign innovation, because you're going to get this benefit from importing products from other countries. We're going to get kind of 50-50. So in fact, you might think of it as kind of a 50-50 paper, because it's close to 50-50 Romer versus Ricardian growth. Trade is going to be close to 50-50. It's 42% Romerian, 58% Ricardian. So again, kind of close to 50-50. And then home versus foreign innovation source of growth, it's like 50-50 home, 55 home, 45 foreign innovation. And it differs some of the details, like that we're going to find the US is big at coming up with Romerian varieties, and also does most of its own innovation. So it's an outlier relative to most countries in the world. However, there's the other extreme. There's just some small economies that get most of their innovation from abroad, say like Canada. We're going to estimate. So one reaction we had to this, though, was that, I should say this too. So if 42% is Romerian, the US is like 96% of its exports look Romerian to us, look like it's introduced something new to the world. And then eventually somebody like China takes it over. So China's not doing that much new stuff. It's doing a lot more of the creative destruction stuff, taking advantage of the low wages, innovating a little bit on a foreign product and taking over a lot of markets in the process. So there's heterogeneity underneath the 50-50-50 numbers. But if you want to take away a number from the paper, that would be at 50-50.
Are these just like the balanced growth decompositions, or is this like a transition?
Purely steady state. Yeah, we haven't done any transition analysis yet.
Okay.
But we could, because I mean, part of what we're doing is like brute force simulation of, and since we have exogenous arrival rates, that limits how interesting the analysis is if you think the arrival rates change. But we could easily do things like change tariffs or change some of the arrival rates and see what happens.
But does this basically say people shouldn't be doing closed accounting macro?
Well, that's always true.
Hear that?
Well, there's always, benefit of doing open accounting, actually.
Even for a household problem?
So one side point before I go into more details is that, this is much lower than my prior. My prior would have been, 45% of patents in the US are international companies and individuals, companies basically filing patents. So we thought US growth was 45% international, and then everybody else had a higher fraction than that. Like in Belgium, 97%, I'm getting this from the core paper. A lot of what I do builds on the same stuff, so this is not unusual. So they had really nice papers saying what's cross-patenting patterns. And, you look at smaller countries in the US, and it's the majority of patents are filed by foreign companies and foreign citizens. So I would have thought the majority of growth everywhere would have come from innovation abroad. So this framework doesn't say that. It says a smaller fraction than that. So that surprised me. So that's one thing surprising. And I didn't have any guess on what this number was going to be, whether it was going to be Romerian or Ricardian. But I kind of like, selfishly, I kind of like the 50-50 number, because it means anybody who wants to do either of the two tracks can cite this and say, see, this track is important, or this type of trade is important.
Hey, do you have an intuition for why your prior was wrong about the foreign versus domestic? That
Yeah,
all those foreign patents, why aren't they 50% of what's going on in the US?
yeah, I mean, one initial thought is like, are they commercialized to the same extent? Are they as important? You know, that's obviously hard to do, but first thing I would want to look at is like citations.
But I'm saying something in what you've already done within your framework. There's something saying it's different than that.
Yeah, you're saying.
Something in the data you are using that's pushing it in that direction of being more.
Well, the trade
domestic.
shares, this is going to be the manufacturing sector. The trade shares are around 20%, obviously bigger in some
So
countries.
that's kind of playing in maybe.
Yeah, that's my primary intuition is that that's where the foreign growth is coming from, is from the products you import and most stuff you consume domestically, produce domestically. Yeah, so that makes it surprising that there's so many international patents, although maybe some of the international patents protect, you know, maybe multinational production or something, which isn't in the model at all. So maybe that's another channel through which these products are. So maybe this is an underestimate because it doesn't have the MNC channel. Yeah. Okay, so let me describe more what we do. So as I was describing, we have this room. We'll define things Romerian if only one country knows how to produce it. Ricardian if more than one does. Some version of it, some quality level of it. We just have one factor, fixed factor, exogenously supplied, growing at a constant rate in every country of like 1% a year. So we're gonna have labor growth. We're gonna have CS demand across the Romerian, you know, across the quality ladders, and then it's sigma equal 3, and then we're going to have this vertical differentiation on the ladder, and then we have this Mallett's fixed cost of selling in each market denominated in labor. So that's kind of cool. There's some properties that come out of that I didn't think of until we wrote this down. In terms of growth, in terms of like how much varieties contribute to growth, the fact that there's a fixed cost for each variety, I guess I can anticipate it. We're tantalize you hopefully by saying it's kind of interesting. I didn't think about this. I always thought about like varieties grow. And I didn't think about that if you linked an overhead cost of production, like in the Mallett's model, you can't get varieties growing. Just somebody introduces a new variety, that's going to drive out another variety because there's only so much labor to go around to cover the fixed costs for all these things. Even though I totally knew that in the Mallett's model and static models, somehow when we do growth models, I'm used to thinking no fixed costs and the varieties are growing to the sky. So this tightly links net variety growth to population growth. But you can still have growth from new varieties because the new variety that comes in is going to be a higher quality than the one that drives out, which is going to be the marginal one by definition. So it's like, in a variety innovation is doing what's in the Mallett's model that trade does, which is it drives out these marginal varieties. That's what the creation of new varieties, not coming from abroad necessarily, but also just in general coming from home or abroad. So varieties will still contribute to growth, but not through net variety growth, except to the extent there's population growth. But that's not trivial because you get 1% population growth, that's 1% more varieties, and then 1 over sigma minus 1, the variety gain from that. We're going to have a sigma of 3, so that's like 0.5% per year of growth right from that. And then we're going to have the usual variable, the tariff basically for selling in each market, selling in foreign markets, not in the domestic market. And then the Romerian products won't be sold everywhere because of these fixed costs of selling in each market. So you'll have interesting things like in Eton, Cortum, and Cremards, like bigger markets will get more of these varieties than smaller markets will. And then Ricardian, just in the Eton, Cortum type framework, you have to be the lowest cost supplier in that market to enter that market. So you have lots of non-traded stuff that the comparative advantage isn't strong enough to overcome the tariffs. Or whatever wage differences there exist. So again, you get an endogenous distribution of world TFP that's going to come from the technology differences, and we're going to have balanced trade, but also the labor endowment will matter for outcomes as well. You'll see, like I was saying, bigger economies will get more variety of imports and more variety of domestic variety because they've got more labor to spread around, produce more varieties, import more varieties. Okay, more details. So this is like the static portion of the model. At a point in time, you have all these technologies and either some vertical competition and a bunch of horizontal competition, and you can solve the model with balanced trade, which we're going to do, numerically for like 20 countries. But then we're also going to add on top of this exogenous arrival of innovations. So this is like something I've done in a couple other papers, and let me apologize first and then say why I shouldn't completely apologize, which is that, on the one hand, exogenous arrival of innovations, I don't think innovation is exogenous in the real world. So the reason why I think it's interesting is we're going to do, accounting with it. It's kind of a model-based decomposition asking where's growth coming from. We're not saying the growth would be invariant to an R&D subsidy or a change in tariffs or anything like that. So you want to actually see us do any counterfactuals today. It's more of like, we observe this data, imagine that's a steady state of the model, it's a balanced growth path of 20 countries, and infer what's happening in that equilibrium. So in that sense, we're not assuming exogeneity of these things in the real world any more than any growth accounting would, right? When somebody says this much growth comes from labor or human capital or physical capital, they didn't assume that physical capital was exogenous. They were just trying to measure its growth and its approximate contribution. So that's what we're doing. And then we're going to have these arrival rates of the creation of new varieties, and J is one of the 20 countries. Each country will have their own arrival rate. And I already anticipated the US is going to have a high kappa. And then we're going to have these quality ladder jumps. We want, this one we don't need except, so we have international creative destruction. So country J will have some rate at which it, for each variety that it has, it'll have an arrival rate delta on drawing on another country's varieties and improving upon them. So China will be really important even if they have a low delta because it's per variety and they're a big economy. So they're going to have a lot of varieties. So they're going to do a lot of creative destruction because they're big, even conditional on their delta being 1,000 times bigger than some other countries. Okay, so but what I was going to say was this one we debated whether to even have it because make our life easier if we didn't have another parameter. In fact, what I was describing at the beginning was new variety creation versus international creative destruction. So like Chang and I have an earlier paper where it was Daniel Garcia Macia, where we claimed, over half of growth came from countries improving its own products. In fact, firms improving their own products, like Intel or Apple, successive generations of products. So it felt a little bit weird not to have that at all in our model. So, and plus, this could be one firm doing it to itself. It could be one firm doing it to another firm within a domestic economy. So we're not going to separate that out because we don't have any firm level data. We just have these country exports. So we can't really distinguish one US firm took over another US firm's product versus that US firm improved its own product. So this lambda is some combination of domestic creative destruction and domestic own incumbent variety improvement. Okay, so that's why we have it though. And then the issue is going to be, how do we infer that? That's going to put another challenge on the inference. Because my intuition I gave you was like, hey, burst in export growth without shrinking your imports, that looks like new varieties. A burst in export growth substituting for your imports, that's shrinking your imports, that sounds like this. We're going to need some other moment to help identify those by country. Okay, so we have Pareto draws partly because that's going to get, more dispersion, but also, more dispersion in growth rates because the data on export growth across products has a lot of dispersion in it. So we didn't want things artificially lumping on one step size, one growth rate in particular.
So just to be clear, Pete, like if you have a new product that you start, like your quality ladders, that you kind of come in and they kind of start gaining more and more market share in foreign markets, you're going to interpret that all as coming from the quality ladder part, as opposed to some learning that happens with the firm creation process.
Well, we take like 5-year periods to do these changes, partly because we imagine there's some, adjustment costs. Could be learning, it could be building up customer base. And I point to Kim, he's got some stuff on that, where once you start exporting, there's some growth post-exporting. It's pretty rapid. In the US, a lot of the post-entry growth of firms and plants is like in the first 5 years. The 5 years number we took wasn't random, but we're not modeling that. Yeah.
No, I was just trying to see how it would kind of push into one category versus the other category.
I think it would push into this.
Okay.
Yeah.
It would, without the middle one also would really be kind of problematic because it would say opening up as a force of change in the relative importance of this quality ladder versus the other, because you'd have, if you shut down trade, there'd be only Romer type growth.
That's true.
So you'd be kind of stacking the deck in a way.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Yep.
Just to kind of the language. So you're gonna look at steady state.
Yeah, balanced growth path. I mean,
So when you say I have this thing, I get a burst of exports, but then imports don't change, whatever. I mean,
Yeah, sorry.
it's really a relative price effect, right? 'Cause the exports, you have a trade balance at every point in time. So it's also, it's really a relative price movement in the background.
Yeah, so picture, if I come up with a Romer variety, one category that we look at, say we look at 1,000 categories, can show a burst of growth, and the other 999 can show modest shrinkage of growth. Whereas if it's like, oh, I used to import that from, I used to produce it domestically, sorry, yeah. Say China used to import something to Vietnam, now it produces itself, it's gonna see this burst of exports to, say, the US, at the same time it sees this big shrinkage of its imports from Vietnam. That's what we're picturing.
So it's the diffuse, okay.
Yeah, we're gonna look, yeah. So we're gonna look at like the thickness of the tails, it's gonna be big tails, and this stuff. Let's see, so,
But again, just any sort of like churning at the industry level, that would be coming from just, I don't know, factor prices changing or something, would all be kind of loading in on the lambda, as opposed to just some industry shocks.
yeah, if it's not like tail behavior,
Yeah.
then it's gonna look a lot like lambda, I agree.
Okay.
That's true. Like, I mean, if there was a demand shock for one country's production relative to the others, it was kind of modest, it would look like this, right? Yeah, it would look like they start to export more and start to import modestly less and export modestly more in that category. So really, oh, that looks like you improved something you already did. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so one thing to clarify though, just like not all the Romerian varieties are sold everywhere, they got to be good enough. That's true too. If you make a quality ladder improvement, US improves on some quality level in China, it's 5% better, but the wage difference is still 60%. The US is not going to be able to even sell in the US market, because the tariffs aren't going to be that high. So China will still maintain control of that. So the US will have a bunch of wasted delta draws, and the low wage countries will have a really high conversion rate of their creative destruction draws because their wages are low, so they're going to be able to overcome tariff barriers. And not only for taking over foreign markets, but even taking over the domestic market. If if China innovates on an imported good, really high probability they're going to take that over in the domestic market as well. So that's why we've got these endogenous probabilities, and things like not only do wage differences matter, but tariffs matter too. The probability to replace the import, it's increasing in the amount of tariff protection. That's just like that non-traded region gets wider, like in Bornbush, Fisher, Samuelson, when there's a higher tariff. But then the opposite, when you come, if China imitates a competitor and now has trying to get into the foreign market, that's going to be harder to do the higher the tau. So you have these asymmetric things going on. So that's going to help us. Obviously, we're going to choose the taus to fit the trade shares partly, but it's kind of interesting how this asymmetry works for taus in terms of the probability to succeed. Okay, so this is just one way to. This is we simplified relative to what we do. This would be like 2 countries, J and K, whereas we had 20 countries. So if you look at the math in the paper, these are sums across 20 countries. The innovation coming from abroad comes from 19 different source countries, I should say, from one country's perspective. But this is just to keep the presentation more concise. And then the paper, we allow the tau J, tau sub K, to take it to help understand, because we're certainly going to get bigger countries have lower trade shares, but we're going to also get high tau countries. We need tau variation to fit the trade share. Okay, because that's one of the first things we certainly want to fit. Okay, so this is simplified in a couple of dimensions, but it allows me to recap the, domestic innovation has this, domestic creative destruction. It could be on exported products or non-traded stuff, or own innovation, if you want to call it that. Then there's the creative destruction that, say, the US would do on foreign products. This is the arrival rate, and this is going to determine the success rate. And the shape parameter matters because it's got to be good enough. So the probability it's good enough is going to be a function of theta. And then this is the arrival rates of the Romerian varieties. And then they can get all these things from abroad, as well as this is kind of a special category, which is like something where the comparative advantage wasn't strong enough for the US to import it. So it was a not traded category, but we might get it for the first time if it improved enough, if there was some quality improvement on it, quality ladder improvement on it, it made comparative advantage strong enough, and we got a new variety that way. I shouldn't say comparative advantage strong enough, it just became good enough that we start importing it new. So it doesn't have to be new to the world, this could be just new to country J. So that's happening in the model. And then just this, this previews like how we're going to do this. We're going to say these are the domestic source of innovation, these are the foreign source of innovation, and then we're going to say, these things are the Romerian new variety growth, and these things are the quality growth. So you can just see right there how we're going to do that. Those two types of 2x2 accounting. But once we estimate these parameters, we're going to do these calculations to see what share of growth.
So Pete, relative to your paper with Shea and
Christy and Masya?
no, with the guy who was just on the job market.
Keen Ron? No.
No, the one you presented.
Presented virtual ITM, Nathan.
Oh, Ishan Nath.
Yes. Yeah. No,
Okay, good.
okay. Where is he?
He's postdocing at Princeton, but he's going to SFA.
Oh, okay. Because this has some overlap with it. I mean, that one, the line with the imported kind of reminds me of that because it's kind of like the quality ladders and then how often is that going to push you over to.
Yeah.
So that doesn't have the variety stuff, I guess.
Right.
And it
It's
only
all-
has two countries.
And it doesn't have, it only has this. It doesn't have, it doesn't have this or the kappas. It doesn't have the kappas or the lambdas. That was pure creative destruction.
Right, okay, so the creative destruction part of it is similar though, except
Yes.
for now you have many countries.
Right.
And then you have the variety kind of competing.
Yes.
Competing
Yes.
explanation.
But you're right. So what's different is this broadening it to do the.
But what it doesn't, it is kind of building more off Grossman-Hellman than EK in the sense that it doesn't have, you're not kind of drawing from a given source distribution, you're sort of building on what can be.
Yes. So I should have said that earlier. This one aspect of that is this Pareto is not the same theta shape parameter from a static draw from the distribution. So because it's going to be the step size, the cross-sectional distribution of productivities isn't going to follow for Shea or Pareto.
Yeah.
It's going to be something else.
Yeah, and you're taking a more numerical, you're taking like simulation approach to say, who cares, just do it.
Yeah, and when you looked at it, it doesn't look for Shea or Pareto.
Yeah.
So we're like, okay, maybe we could try to figure out a way to but we figured with these fixed costs floating around, we couldn't make this thing look Pareto. We couldn't reverse engineer a way to make the cross-sectional distribution look for Shea or Pareto. So we kind of gave up and said, let's just stick with the numerical. But thank you for asking me to compare it to that other paper, because you can see we're doing something different, but there's definitely overlap in the creative destruction part. I shouldn't say we don't. I shouldn't say we don't have the lambdas. We have domestic creative destruction and foreign creative destruction on paper, but there's no own innovation component.
And
No
does this one
varieties.
have the kind of building on the other guys?
Yep.
That spillover is common.
Yes, that's common, and that's what's tethering countries together.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, so that gave you a flavor, and then this is also to convey something that this is also special because it's two countries still, and we're even, for simplicity, getting rid of the tariffs for a second, and just saying, where are we going to get this? So this was giving you a preview of how I'm going to get the 2x2, how much growth is domestic versus foreign, how much growth is quality of qualities versus varieties. Once we estimate these parameters, we can just calculate, this is a sum of a fraction of the whole column, this is a fraction of the whole column, and vice versa, the domestic and foreign. In terms of the cross section, at any point in time, what's going to be happening is you're going to be gaining some Romerian varieties, and then some of your trade that your exports that were Romerian, you're going to lose to foreign creative destruction. They have a certain arrival rate, but then a certain success rate that's based on the relative wages. And then if you have Ricardian exports, you're going to gain some at a certain rate, which you creative destroy somebody else, and the ones you have, you're going to lose at a certain rate to the other country in this two-country example. So if you just take these two cases, what you get is that the Romer share of your exports divided by the Ricardian share in this two-country no trade cost case has this nice expression where it's just like Romerian varieties, the fraction increases with the arrival rate of your Romerian varieties and decreases with the fraction of your arrival rate of Ricardian varieties. And there's a wage thing that matters there too. It's messier when we do 20 countries, but we'll actually show you this is pretty good. This is going to look pretty good as a predictor of your Romerian and Ricardian shares.
And it gets kind of the fact US has high wages, that's why most of it's Romerian.
Yes,
So it
because-
kind of sets that.
Yep. This is you're gonna see the arrival rate's not so bad. It's it's the relative wages killing it. So then how do we explain why the US is rich?
This does something new.
Yeah, it does something new, exactly. And it's gonna turn out to not have a lot of times where its import growth really shrinks. So it looks like it's not replacing its imports with its stuff. It's coming up with new stuff. So that's the way in which the US looks unusual to us. It has really high wages, so it can't, so this term's bad, and this, so we're gonna put the richness in the numerator, and it fits they don't have a lot of rapid shrinkage of import growth. You can see they're an outlier in that regard too.
Trade costs don't matter for this share of Romerian versus Ricardian.
No, sure, they do. They do,
Oh,
but
when
in this
that's
case,
the
just because we like the formula in this case.
Right, yeah.
And then in the 20 country case with trade variables, I'll show you, I'll plot this against kappa and against delta and say, wow, that's pretty good. So it's not exactly true, but it conveys a bunch of the intuition. Yeah. So this is just reiterating, then there's gonna be a product cycle. Something starts out Romerian and it turns into Ricardian stuff. So depending on how rapidly these things happen, there's gotta be some Romerian stuff, but depending on how rapidly it gets imitated by the rest of the world or innovated upon by the rest of the world, it'll convert into Ricardian quickly. So that's why ex ante, we didn't know if we're gonna get, we kind of knew 0.5% of growth would come from Romerian forces, but that's kind of the only thing we had from intuition at the start. Okay, so this is to,
What I don't quite get is, it seems like you're ruling out effect where the US just kind of does the ladder thing, but just gets many rungs of ladder ahead because you keep having the other guys be able to figure out the last step of the ladder. As if in some other country, they already know the last generation of Intel's technology.
yes.
And then they could even then make the next step ahead, and Intel has to be really good because now they have to beat out their last step produced in Burma or something like that. So
Yeah,
or
okay.
Myanmar. So that seems kind of, I mean, that does seem like a fairly strong
Let me see if I understand correctly.
kind of thing you're
I was
kind of
jumping
making
to-
into it.
I was jumping to something that maybe you are saying, maybe you're not, so let me make sure. So, because we had, all papers work like this, I think, except, I don't know, something that might just write papers in completely linear fashion. So one thing we debated and put in for a while and took out was that, China might just imitate and not innovate, right? They might get a draw. So if you go back to this, we have a scale parameter of 1. So they're starting at the top of the ladder and making an improvement, with an expected step size of theta over theta minus 1. So I interpreted you to possibly be saying, what if a bunch of countries draw less than 1? They can't imitate Intel's or Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing corporation's best chip. They can just do a lower quality chip version of it. Might be cheaper. That would insulate the US from a lot of creative destruction.
Yeah, and then it would mean that when Taiwan or the US make a step ahead, it's not going to be downweighted by that wage thing because they're already way ahead. They're gonna, they got it for sure.
Right, that's right, exactly. That's what's causing the poor countries to do a lot of creative
And then
destruction.
wouldn't you then interpret that, oh, that's variety now because of that? Within the lens of your model, then you would.
Yes, we'd force it into here.
Like that, and it's really.
Yeah, the US is rich. It's going to be bad at all these things because of its wage disadvantage, right? It's going to have a bunch of wasted draws here, and even though it's it's improving its own products. All it takes is somebody to innovate on them and take them over. Intel's always just one foreign innovation away.
Never get it. Okay.
Yeah, they're not like 10 steps ahead of the competitor. They're drawing with a Pareto shape less than 1. So that's what we put in for a while, which really helps nail the TFP data. So maybe we should put it back in because it seems kind of intuitive and reasonable. Yeah, and maybe you're right. Maybe it would tilt things toward this type of growth as opposed to. But the U.S. interestingly is the outlier. It doesn't seem to be doing it to all the rich countries. You'll see what we get on that though. Yeah.
Does all countries consume all existing varieties?
No, because these fixed costs of exporting to each market. So then there's going to be,
So if it's like making innovation on some existing goods, but it doesn't import before, so like those kind of innovation won't shrink its imports, right?
Like this kind of stuff? This kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This would be like a new variety to the country, but it's not new to the world. Is that what you mean?
So that will be which one, like that still be Ricardian?
Yeah, I mean, I think we disagree on that within our co-author team. So we're, I want that to be Ricardian, and it's under the Romerian right now. I don't think it's big, but yeah. Which way do you want it?
Yeah, I think if we care about the exporting countries' welfare, we should treat it as well.
Yeah, it's like a variety game. I agree. I'm with you. No, I'm next to no, I'm not the opposite. Sorry. You're with them. You're with them.
I'm with that.
Yeah, you're with them. Okay. Let's see. So this just gives you a flavor of what I mean. So this country on the left here is a big own innovation countries or domestic creative destruction. So they don't have as thick a right tail as a country that does a lot of international creative destruction. They have like a thicker right tail of export growth. So what we've got here is export growth rate. And these are two sample countries, J and K. And the one that does a lot of creative destruction should have this big import growth, thicker right tail. You can ask where the zero is nothing happened, but this country's sometimes taking over some products, so that's why it still has some right tail. So it's not as clean as we wanted, but it shows up. And then this is like comparing the largely improving your own products world as well, which has a lot of modest growth to it, because just you're improving your own products, to somebody who creates a new variety, they're going to have a thick right tail too. So far you just see you have a thick right tail of export growth, both from creative destruction back here or from new varieties here. And then of course, next thing we say is what do the import side look like? If you do a lot of international creative destruction, then you have your imports shrink a lot, right? Because the flip side of you taking over the foreign market or taking over from the imports and possibly even exporting nearly, is you don't have to import that product anymore. Whereas if you specialize in new varieties, there's still some left tail, and I'll tell you where that's coming from in a second, but that's not as big. So we would have liked it to be really stark, like nothing here versus everything there, and nothing here, versus nothing in this left tail versus here. What's happening is that building in this overhead cost is generating a lot of obsolescence. Anytime you come up with something new, whether it's a new variety, and like here, that's going to drive out some of your existing varieties, some of which are actually exported. So, I mean, even if it doesn't drive out the production altogether, the increase in its wage can price it out of its exporting. So the new varieties are crowding out some of their own exports. This is an example of what Mark was saying. There's all these general equilibrium forces happening here. Okay, so that's kind of the flavor of what we're trying to do. Now we show you the data. So we're only using 4-digit SIC because that's where we had like very consistent industry definitions for imports and exports, as well as across the countries. So we're aware there's like 10-digit stuff for the US and maybe 6-digit for a bunch of countries, but we tried to use the 6-digit, and there would be like 5 different ways to concord them across countries in a given year. So the inconsistencies, it ended up pushing it so that we were basically dealing with 4-digit anyway when we were trying to aggregate around these differences in HS 6-digit. We could look at it more, but especially if you suggest a good way to do that. And just because of computational constraints, we only have 20 countries, but we chose the biggest traders. So we got 95% of world exports and imports in there. And then, as I should have explained, the +2 here in these pictures, we're taking like the growth, and this is export growth. This would be exports T+5 minus T in a category, and one of the SICs you picture, divided by the average exports in those 2 years. So newly exported category would be +2, and then on the import side, a category where we stopped importing would be -2. That's built into that, putting the average in the denominator. And so we're going to look at the tails. We're going to look at things like, how much right tail behavior is there versus modest growth, because the modest growth is going to be our way to try to pick up you're just improving, Intel improving what you do, and you continue to export it. But that should show up as modest growth as opposed to this explosion of export growth if you're doing a new variety or creative destruction. And we're going to look at the left tail of import growth as well. So here's some motivation of what I was saying. This actually, Canada and Japan look similar in this dimension, but this is like the frequency of large export growth divided by large import decline. So if you're doing creative destruction, they should be about the same. So that's kind of like these lower countries here would be like ones where they're doing creative destruction, and the ones where they're doing new varieties should have high export growth relative to large import declines. That's where you see the US be an outlier there. And we have TFP on this axis. So you see the US looks like the one that we're going to infer from this kind of data that the US is creating a lot of new varieties. And then you see large import decline. The richer countries are doing less of that than the poorer countries. Argentina's an outlier there, but I don't know quite what's going on there. But you see this general pattern of richer countries are doing more of the, or less of the large import decline. It's maybe consistent with the whole channel that their wages are too high for them to take over the foreign markets of things they currently import from cheaper countries. Yeah.
I'm kind of puzzled about how we should think about services trade in the context of this stuff. It's pretty hard to
It's not the
measure.
data that we're looking at.
Yeah, no, well, I know that,
We set it aside.
but it's pretty, I guess, I mean, it would be great to have, but it's pretty hard to, even in data that we can measure services trade, it's really hard to measure like a variety of services trade, right? I mean, in, goods, it's pretty easy, but that's a pretty large, it's a pretty important share of trade, especially for like the United States, which has a big trade surplus in services. And that's, been growing over time. I wonder, at least quantitatively, whether you're missing something, especially for, some smaller countries like the UK or Canada that probably participate.
US ton, and what fraction of, you might know, Kim, what fraction of US exports that are services? That's in.
You think it'd be like the thirds or?
It's
No,
25% or something like that.
For the UK, it's like half.
Okay.
So,
They're a big one though.
but I think it'd be pretty important to take that into account. And I think it'd be really tricky to measure, to attribute changes in services trade to something that's kind of like a variety.
I mean, I can think of examples that would fit that, like new type of software or.
Sure.
Financial.
Conceptually, sure, but I think, in terms of measurement, I think it'd be pretty tricky.
Yeah, because they might be all lumped in one category. One advantage of manufacturing.
Yeah,
is that
I mean,
thousands
what's
of
one, what's one movie versus another movie? Is that a new variety? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing related to that I should have said is that I'm about to go to the show you the estimates of our results that come from this kind of stuff. Is that we're assuming elasticity of substitution of 3, because that's kind of what Rhoda Weinstein estimated for after the 4-digit level. So we can talk about whether we like those estimates or not, but well, that's not what I said at Columbia. But anyway, but it would matter whether we say we did 10-digit level. We wouldn't keep sigma 3, of course, right? Because we'd say these are, yes, there's different varieties, but they're trivially different. They're highly substitutable. Yeah, imagine the elasticity sigma is the same as the digit level, 10 versus 4 or whatever. Yeah, so it matters to this, how substitutable these are. So it could be that, yeah, that's at a higher level of aggregation in services, and there'd be a lower elasticity of substitution between them. So maybe it wouldn't be so sensitive to, it'd be harder to do the indirect inference at the higher level of aggregation, because we'd see the tail behavior is going to be smudged more. So I think it would be harder. Yeah.
So Pete, just to read this, so the vertical axis of the left one means there was a large import decline, meaning for our, I don't know, that's India, I guess. It had 20%. What is the 0.2 for India?
It's like 20% of the time the import decline was -1 or bigger than -1. So 20% of the
rarely was for the USA.
right. So the US doesn't see a lot of big slashing of its imports. You can see we're going to infer from that it's not creatively destroying stuff that's being imported. We think that's consistent with the model saying you can't compete on wage. The US has got to compete on variety, where it comes up with a lot of new exports, but it's not really replacing an import. Yeah, and that kind of fits Canada and Japan too, but they're kind of outliers, and then the rest kind of line up nicely against TFP. We're plotting this against the TFP data. So we think this is kind of interesting because it's showing these patterns don't seem to be completely random with respect to TFP. So it's giving us the intuition that the rich countries are disproportionately variety creators, and the poor countries are disproportionately creative destroyers. And again, that makes sense. Even if you had the same arrival rates, they would succeed at different rates. Well, I mean, not the same arrival rates of the capitalists, the same arrival rates of the international creative destruction. This should be the success rate, which is the probability you draw and the wage difference. So that's China should find it easier to take over a foreign product. The US should try to find it really hard to do that down here.
And that's as a share of the products that declined, or as a
Yes,
share of
well-
all products.
The share of import declined, and this is the share of export growth that were large. So like I was showing you in these pictures, I was showing you like half the distribution. This is the import decline half. This is the export growth half. So it'd be like, you know, this and above is a share of all of it. Or, you know, in the imports, this and below is a share of all of it. Yeah. So these are the key, you know, patterns in the data that were used to estimate things, basically. Okay, so I've kind of talked through this already. I mean, there's some more details in that, like, but that's basically the intuition. You might say, where's the aggregate step size come from? That we're going to use the aggregate growth rate to pin down. Okay, so here's put into like 5 categories just to make it more manageable. This is why I said trade shares are roughly 20%. And then the US is an outlier in the sense of not having a lot of import shrinking pattern compared to other countries. China is kind of an outlier. Well, China and the rest of the world picture them poorer than the US, EU. They're kind of an outlier relative to the richer countries in terms of how frequently they have, how infrequently they have small export changes. So that we're going to also kind of be saying they're not going to be well, it's going to, all of these are going to feed into all 3 parameters. So
These are, you're thinking about this as a balanced growth path, right? But the data is clearly not that. So are there some adjustments we want to be thinking about at these moments in this period that you're looking at?
well, one thing we do is we always take out like the net growth rate of exports and the growth rate of imports. So when we're doing these distributions, it's all relative to the average growth rate of all exports across all categories. That's the only thing we do to kind of take out the fact that there's some unbalanced behavior. Some countries, exports are growing faster than others.
No, I'm just saying, the period you're looking at, China becomes much more integrated into the world. And
Right.
A lot of that is, some of that is
You're saying the trade
technology,
share.
and some of that is, just it becomes like a bigger, or yeah, some of it's technology. Sorry,
Yeah.
trade barriers, right?
Yeah, the WCO, the Pearson shot.
Or other stuff too. Yeah.
But then also, maybe they went from being much more of delta to being much more of kappa, and much more of international creative destruction. And they're doing a lot more new variety stuff now. So that may not be stationary too. The relative TFP isn't stuck at 0.4
No,
over
sure.
the whole sample.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a limitation.
So, Peter, I'm sorry, can you go back to that other picture? I think I was the one before, yeah.
Good.
So that
My favorite
vertical axis is import shrinking being higher.
Yes.
So it means that like in China, they could get good at doing something and then just stop importing it
Yep.
totally. The US, that just doesn't happen because
Right.
there's some guy who can produce it dirt cheap and you can't
Yeah.
beat that guy out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, that's exactly our story. And then, but yet the US and Japan are high in terms of the new big export growth relative to how frequently so we look at that and say, oh, they're good at new varieties relative to replacing versus international creative destruction.
But in an absolute sense, they might not be that great at the large export.
That's true.
You're dividing it by the thing that goes.
That's true. They're relative. They're
I mean, I guess you should do it, maybe you should show us just the
I showed the
like
third
growth,
graph.
it's either flat.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, I'll do that. Okay, so now I'm ready to show you results, which is like, so this is the one where the US stands out. It's the new variety creation, the kappa. So even relative to the EU, China's lower than the EU and China's lower than the rest of the world, so they're not particularly good at that. But the US is what really stands out as an outlier there. And then on imported products, these are just a arrival rate. So it looks like China's not very good at it, and the US is actually better. But US and the EU they can't convert those very well, right? Because their wages are so high that they get these draws, but they still can't compete with the low wages. That relative wage term is killing them. And then this is per variety, so China ends up being really important. You'll see in like the share of Ricardian products from China is high. Even though it looks like they're not coming up with a lot of Ricardian creative destruction, it's the conversion rate is so high. And then here's the rate at which you're improving domestic products, which is surprisingly high in China. Maybe they're imitating stuff or innovating on forms, then they're making improvements over time. Okay, so I'll show you some more plots, but this is like the domestic versus foreign innovation. This is the 45-55. So the US is like more than that. EU is more from domestic. China's more from the rest of the world. They get 60% of the growth. But again, I would have thought that number would be smaller. I would have thought this number would be bigger for the rest of the world. Sorry, I would have thought domestic innovation, these numbers would be smaller and these would be bigger. So, so the US kind of is, all of these numbers are bigger than I would have thought. I would have thought my prior was 55 for this and higher than 55 for these. So maybe only EU kind of fits my prior on that. But this is kind of interesting, and certainly it's a step. I don't think we can do gains from trade because we've got these exogenous arrival rates. If you trade barriers, that would be a strong assumption. But it's pretty tempting from this to say, if this is happening in equilibrium, the gains from openness internationally must be big. Okay, so then we can do a cross-section at a point in time, how much of US exports are Romerian, and it's huge, to China, but to everywhere, basically, to the rest of the world. 96% of our exports are Romerian, whereas China's 24% of its exports are Romerian. You can see EU and Japan are actually not that far above that. We don't quite get that. We would have thought EU and Japan would be more Romerian. Maybe that's your point. The absolute was high. The relative was high, but the absolute wasn't that high. So they're not generating a bunch of new varieties from EU and Japan. So this is our breakdown. For the world as a whole, we're saying 42% Romerian, 58% at point in time Ricardian. So I should have another plot. Let me show you this quick. Yeah, this is saying products start Romerian, and then some fraction of them turns into Ricardian. So the data is some mix of this. So that's why at a point in time you see 42% Romerian, this stuff, and then the 58% that's out there Ricardian. So this was that equation that I really liked. It was so simple. It's saying it's not perfect, sorry, but it looks pretty good, which is just your own gain Romerian export rate here, which is like your kappa, against your share of Romerian exports. It's really strongly positive. And then you could have asked, what about the rate at which you lose your Romerian exports? Why shouldn't that matter so much? And it doesn't vary that much across countries. That's the key. So everybody's losing their products at similar rates, pretty similar rates. So the variation in Romerian export shares is coming from that numerator more than the denominator variation across countries. So, and the same thing on the gain Romerian exports. It's it's a share of Romerian. Sorry, gain Ricardian export. It's share of Romerian. Yeah, I thought I had something else next. Let me skip that. Okay, this is what I was saying. Like if you do it like the age of the product in the model, and you see U.S. starts, with the in a cohort that's exporting a lot of Romerian stuff, and then that shrinks as the cohort gets older, and China is taking over those products, and EU and Japan is taking over a bunch of those products. That kind of surprised us. We thought EU and Japan and the rest of the world would flip, that they'd have a lot of Romerian products and then lose them, and the rest of the world would be imitating them. So this is what we expected, kind of, and this is kind of flipped relative to what we expected. So great explanation for that. But, okay, so I went faster than I intended. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just,
Oh, that kind of product cycle thing is sort of like actually in that Krugman, the world distribution of income paper from 1939.
I don't know if I knew that one.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones where it's the US or the North is kind of innovating, and then the South just has much lower wages, and it's slowly learning about how to do those things. And when they do, they get shift back
This
to.
is a precursor to Grossman-Helpman.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And you'd like it because it's exogenous innovation as well.
I don't like that.
Okay.
Grossman-Helpman endogenized.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but then there was it was Rose and somebody else had this.
Feaster?
They had a paper right when I was just starting
Feaster
as
and
an
Rose.
assistant professor. They were kind of looking at the data, kind of like the data you're looking at for these patterns of first exported from a rich country and then it gets imported.
Yeah,
And
they
they didn't find very strong. It was kind of disappointing, and I actually was surprised. I mean, it was one of those ones where it was disappointing, partly because it just seemed like it would obviously be there in the data. They weren't finding it. Gagnon and Rose.
Oh, it's a different one.
Yeah, you might want to look at that just to see why it is they weren't
So,
seeing evidence for that.
Gagnon.
It is kind of
Yeah.
old,
okay,
so
okay.
maybe it changed over time.
Yeah, so I knew about the Feaster and Rose paper. I kind of remembered it and said, hey, we're rediscovering
Yeah,
That's the gross-
Gagnon, wasn't he a treasury or something?
Yeah, it was Fed. He may have temporarily gone to the treasury. The Fed, so go again, if we're talking about the same.
Yeah, I think that's the first.
Okay, that's a great reference. So yeah, and just to be clear, we're talking about empirical papers. So the
His was empirical, kind of
Krugman.
motivated by Krugman,
Right.
says we should look at this, let's look at it, oh, we don't really see it.
so Krugman model, exogenous, Grossman-Heltman endogenous.
Krugman was basing it on kind of narratives of Vernon, I think,
Okay,
and it was one of his first papers.
okay, that's cool. Yeah, okay, so we should definitely look at the Gagnon and Rose. The Feenstra and Rose is pretty supportive, this idea that things are initially produced in rich countries, and then as the product ages, it gets filled in the other people's trade matrix. So that's one we definitely cite. Yeah, so we'll have to look at the one that's not so good, but also by Rose too. But one thing I was going to say about this, it's about the endogenous innovation is that there's this tension that exists in the Grossman-Heltman model, which is that on the one hand, rich countries get to export to developing countries, so increase the scale of the market for the demand for new innovations, the Romerian products, if you will, in our framework. But so that should stimulate innovation. On the other hand, to the extent that they creatively destroy, they've reduced the return to innovating. So you have this tension. So potentially, if we went, in a subsequent paper, maybe, or maybe in this paper, endogenized innovation rates, then we could start saying something about whether openness stimulated growth or detracted from growth. So that could be pretty interesting, because it certainly looks like rents early on, and then they're taken away by imitation from another country, from the U.S. versus China. And like I said, China could be doing a lot more innovating now.
So Peter, I mean, just since you're looking at these, since the changes in trade flows are so important for your navigation, have you thought about like just controlling for things that are not things that you're thinking about? Like, a big change in tariffs is going to have like big changes in trade flows, and it's going to show up in a particular way. And it's not really, what you're talking about in terms of identification there.
Yeah, like there's a big bang change in tariffs. It's going to show up as simultaneous, like all of a sudden they start exporting and stop importing things.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it'll look like exports and imports both grow. So maybe that'll.
It depends on, depends on the
Yeah.
precise structure of how the tariffs are going to change and the
Fair enough.
substitutability of the products. Just seems like you could do, you're leveraging so much on like the variation in trade growth, but there's other things that people say
Yeah,
control those.
we're saying all of trade growth variation comes from these
These two things.
kappa, lambda, and delta.
Yep.
Right.
Holding tau constant.
Right, tau is being held fixed. Yes,
That's just not a good approximation in this period for
I don't know, it might not be. I don't know if it's not.
certain
It
countries.
might not be.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's certain countries, certain time periods, probably like Mexico and US right after NAFTA or something. Yeah, and Kim has stuff with him on that, of like a lot of tail behavior there right after that was induced by tariffs and innovation. I mean, it's totally a fair comment. I just wasn't necessarily conceding.
You don't have to concede.
It's a phrase bad approximation.
It might not be the best approximation.
Okay.
Better.
I agree, completely agree. So yeah, just to remind you, 50-50 paper, we're saying, which we kind of like, again, for marketing purposes, so people can kind of feel free to do what they want, but we'll see if these numbers survive. So I've already touched on directions for future work, maybe this paper, maybe not. I was kind of thinking we want more disaggregated evidence, because the more disaggregated it gets more lumpy. Like you can see the small economies have more of the tail behavior. So in our model, there's smaller populations, so that's fewer products. So it fits perfectly the intuition we have. You can see a lot more of the extensive margin, whereas the big economies like US and China are less stark because they're smoothing so much of the behavior with aggregation. So we're tempted to go more disaggregated somehow, but data is a constraint. We're tempted to endogenize the arrival rates, because we can then talk about lots of interesting policy things. And then, of course, there's, feels kind of surreal to be talking about all this trade without, all the pain that's associated with like the China shock to workers in the United States. It seems rather insensitive that we just have a, frictionless labor market with no employment effects of any of that. So, as people have talked about a long time, you can have interesting trade-offs between, trade and growth and employment. And once you bring that in, and inequality, lots of stuff that we don't have here. So, but also tariff changes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Pete. So I'm hopeful, like, oh, someone will clap, so you wanted to clap. So we're gonna start back exactly at 3. I'm hoping that there's coffee out there. I was kind of hoping for it. We'll see if there is any out there. But we can kind of take things, go outside for a couple minutes or continue chatting with Pete. So I think Joe was bringing up some interesting things when you think about like services, right? In the sense that these are all growth models, and the way it's sort of set up is like the engine growth is all from the manufacturing side. Manufacturing side is kind of small. I wonder if you could kind of do something with the service sector, maybe think about activity. A lot of all the growth is coming from one sector. It's hard to sustain it. It's from one. So maybe like you want to add like multiple sectors, materials, FDI.
Yeah, that's true, especially if you did this.
But see, when you do this growth accounting exercise, it's like extra science. Hey, how are you? Good, good.
I don't know, I have jobs, whatever. I didn't know they had that. I'm very happy. It's my first impossible. We have to so, we have to